Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the same man has shaped the destiny of your country for more than 2 decades. A man respected by some, feared by others, and watched by the entire world. His decisions influence global politics. His words move financial markets, and his actions can send shockwaves across continents. Today, he is one of the most powerful leaders on earth. But power was never guaranteed, because long before the Kremlin, long before the headlines, and long before world leaders learned his name, Vladimir Putin was just a boy growing up in the shadows of war, in a city scarred by destruction, a city where survival was not an achievement, it was a necessity. The streets were rough, the future was uncertain, and weakness was something you could not afford. So how did a boy from a cramped apartment in post-war Leningrad rise through the ranks of the Soviet system, outmaneuver rivals, and become one of the most influential figures of the 21st century? This is the story of Vladimir Putin. To understand Vladimir Putin, we first need to understand the city that shaped him. The year was 1952. World War II had officially ended years earlier, but in the Soviet city of Leningrad, the war never truly disappeared. Its scars were everywhere, in the streets, in the buildings, and in the memories of those who had survived it. This was not just another city. Leningrad had endured one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history. For nearly 900 days, German forces surrounded the city. Food supplies vanished, temperatures plunged below freezing, and hundreds of thousands of people died from hunger, disease, and cold. When the war finally ended, Leningrad survived, but it would never be the same again. Among the survivors were Vladimir Putin's parents. His father had been seriously wounded during the war. His mother narrowly escaped starvation. And before Vladimir was even born, the family had already experienced unimaginable loss. 2 of his brothers died before he entered the world. Loss, sacrifice, survival. These weren't stories from a history book. They were part of everyday life inside the Putin household. Then, on October 7, 1952, Vladimir Putin was born. Not into privilege, not into power, but into a country still struggling to rebuild itself. His family lived in a small communal apartment. Several families shared the same building, the same kitchen, the same hallways, and often the same hardships. There was nothing extraordinary about the young boy growing up there. No signs of future greatness. No signs that one day he would lead Russia or become one of the most recognized political figures on earth. At the time, he was simply another child in post-war Leningrad. But there was something different about him, something that would shape the rest of his life. Young Vladimir hated being seen as weak. In the tough streets of Leningrad, weakness came with consequences. And very soon, that lesson would lead him into a world of street fights, discipline, and relentless determination. A world that would begin transforming an ordinary boy into the man the world knows today. By the time Vladimir Putin reached his teenage years, he had already learned an important lesson. Strength mattered. But physical strength alone was not enough. The toughest person in the room wasn't always the most powerful. Real power often belonged to people nobody could see. People working behind closed doors. People gathering information. People influencing events from the shadows. And that realization changed everything. One day as a young student, Putin became fascinated by the Soviet Union's most secretive organization, the KGB, the Committee for State Security, the intelligence agency responsible for protecting Soviet interests at home and abroad. To many Soviet citizens, the KGB was mysterious, feared, and incredibly powerful. Most people only read about it. Putin wanted to join it. Unlike the image often portrayed in movies, the road into Soviet intelligence was not simple. The KGB didn't recruit dreamers. It recruited disciplined individuals, educated individuals, people who could remain calm under pressure. So Putin focused on something practical: education. In 1970, he entered Leningrad State University to study law. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary decision. But for Putin, it was part of a larger plan. While other students were thinking about careers, Putin was thinking about intelligence work, about secrecy, about influence, about power. The kind of power that didn't need attention, the kind of power that operated quietly, behind the scenes. 5 years later, his patience paid off. In 1975, Vladimir Putin officially joined the KGB. The young boy who once fought in the streets of Leningrad had entered one of the most powerful institutions in the Soviet Union. And although nobody knew it at the time, this decision would shape the rest of his life. Because the KGB would teach Putin lessons far beyond intelligence gathering. Lessons about loyalty, control, strategy, and survival. Lessons he would later carry all the way to the Kremlin. But before reaching the halls of power, Putin would witness an event that shocked the entire world: the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the mid-1980s, Vladimir Putin was no longer a student. He was now a KGB officer, a small piece of a massive Soviet machine. In 1985, he was assigned to East Germany, a communist state located on the front lines of the Cold War. At the time, the Soviet Union appeared powerful. Its military was feared. Its influence stretched across continents. And few people imagined that this superpower was approaching its final years. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Economic problems were growing. Public frustration was rising. And across Eastern Europe, people were starting to demand change. Then came 1989, a year that would change history forever. Across East Germany, protests exploded. Crowds filled the streets. Governments began losing control. And suddenly, the impossible became reality. The Berlin Wall was falling. For millions of people, it was a moment of celebration, a symbol of freedom, a symbol of hope, a symbol of a new beginning. But for Vladimir Putin, it was something very different. It was a warning, a sign that the system he served was losing its grip on power. As demonstrations spread, angry crowds approached government buildings, including offices connected to Soviet intelligence. According to Putin's own recollections, he contacted Soviet military officials for instructions. He waited and waited and waited. No orders came, no reinforcements arrived, no clear response. For a man trained to believe in the strength of the Soviet state, the message was unforgettable. The system was no longer in control. Then in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. One of the most powerful empires in modern history simply ceased to exist. 15 republics became independent nations. The Cold War was over, and millions of people suddenly found themselves living in a completely different world. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was chaos. For Vladimir Putin, it was a national tragedy. Years later, he would describe the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. The empire was gone, the KGB was disappearing, and the future was uncertain. But amid the chaos, Putin saw something else: an opportunity. An opportunity that would eventually carry him from the shadows of intelligence into the heart of Russian politics, and for the first time, toward real power. The Soviet Union was gone. The KGB was collapsing, and the future of Russia was uncertain. Millions had lost faith in the system. The economy was struggling, crime was rising, and political chaos seemed to be everywhere. For many former Soviet officials, this was the end, but for Vladimir Putin, it was a beginning. In 1990, he returned to his hometown of Leningrad, a city now trying to reinvent itself, a city searching for a new future. And it was here that Putin made a decision, a decision that would change his life forever. He stepped out of the world of intelligence and into the world of politics. At first, his role seemed insignificant. He worked closely with Anatoly Sobchak, the reform-minded mayor of St. Petersburg, a man who believed Russia needed change. Most people paid little attention to Putin. He wasn't charismatic, he wasn't famous, and he rarely stood in the spotlight. But behind the scenes, he was learning, watching, building connections, understanding how power really worked. Years passed, and while politicians argued in public, Putin quietly climbed the ladder, step by step, position by position. Then came 1996, a turning point. Putin moved to Moscow, the center of Russian power, the city where careers were made and destroyed. Few people knew his name, but powerful people were beginning to notice him. His reputation was growing, disciplined, loyal, efficient, the kind of man who got things done without attracting attention. And in politics, that can be a powerful combination. Then everything accelerated. In 1998, Putin was appointed head of the FSB, the agency that replaced much of the old KGB. Suddenly, he wasn't operating near power, he was operating inside it. 1 year later, he became Prime Minister of Russia, a position that placed him just one step away from the presidency. But there was a problem. Most Russians still barely knew who he was. He wasn't a national celebrity. He wasn't a political superstar. So why was he rising so fast? Why were powerful figures placing their trust in him? And why was President Boris Yeltsin paying such close attention? The answer would arrive on the final day of the century, December 31st, 1999, a day that changed Vladimir Putin's life forever. Because while the world was preparing to celebrate a new millennium, Russia was about to get a new leader. By the end of 1999, Vladimir Putin had climbed higher than almost anyone could have imagined. Just a few years earlier, he was an unknown government official, a former intelligence officer working behind the scenes. Now, he was standing at the doorstep of power. And then, something extraordinary happened. On December 31st, 1999, while millions of people around the world were preparing to celebrate the new millennium, Russian President Boris Yeltsin made a shocking announcement. He was resigning immediately. The decision stunned the country. Few people expected it. Even fewer understood what would happen next. Because with Yeltsin's resignation, the presidency was handed to a man most Russians barely knew, Vladimir Putin. At just 47 years old, the former KGB officer became acting president of Russia. It was one of the most remarkable political rises in modern history, from the streets of Leningrad to the Kremlin. But becoming president was only the beginning. Keeping power would be much harder. Russia was facing serious challenges. The economy was fragile, public trust was low, and violence was escalating in the North Caucasus. The conflict in Chechnya was growing. Bombings had shocked the nation. Fear was spreading, and Russians were demanding strong leadership. Putin understood something important. People were tired of uncertainty. They wanted stability. They wanted order. And above all, they wanted a leader who appeared strong. So that is exactly the image he presented. Decisive, confident, uncompromising. The strategy worked. His popularity began to rise. Fast, very fast. Then came the presidential election of 2000, the first major test. The first moment when Russians would decide whether this unknown leader deserved their trust. Many observers were still asking the same question: who exactly is Vladimir Putin? But on election day, Russia delivered its answer. He won. Vladimir Putin was no longer acting president. He was now the elected leader of the Russian Federation. And over the years that followed, he would transform Russian politics in ways few could have predicted. Regional governors lost influence. Political rivals faced growing pressure. The state became stronger, and power became increasingly concentrated in Moscow. Supporters argued that Putin had restored stability after years of chaos. Critics argued that Russia was becoming less democratic. But regardless of which side people supported, one thing was becoming impossible to ignore. Vladimir Putin was not a temporary leader. He was building an era that would last not for years, but for decades. And as his influence inside Russia grew, his ambitions on the world stage would grow as well. Soon, the entire world would be watching, and the relationship between Russia and the West would never be the same again. By the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin had achieved what many thought was impossible. He had survived, he had won, and he had secured power. But Putin's ambitions extended far beyond domestic politics. He wanted something bigger. He wanted Russia to matter again. For years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia had struggled. Its economy suffered, its military weakened, and its influence on the world stage had faded. To Putin, this was unacceptable. He believed Russia was not just another country. He believed it was a great power, a nation destined to play a major role in world affairs. And over the next 2 decades, he would do everything in his power to make that vision a reality. As oil and gas revenues increased, Russia's economy began to recover. The military was modernized, government authority expanded, and confidence slowly returned. Then came 2008, a brief war with Georgia, a conflict that signaled something important. Russia was willing to use military force to defend what it considered its interests. The world was paying attention, but even bigger events were still ahead. In 2014, Ukraine erupted into political crisis. A pro-Russian government fell. Protests filled the streets, and tensions between Moscow and the West exploded. Then came Crimea, a peninsula on the Black Sea, strategically important, historically contested, and suddenly at the center of a global crisis. Russia moved quickly. Crimea was brought under Russian control. Moscow described the move as a historic reunification. Many Western governments condemned it and imposed sanctions. Relations between Russia and the West entered a new era, an era of growing distrust, growing tension, and growing confrontation. But Vladimir Putin's influence continued to expand, not just in Russia, but across global politics. Supporters saw a leader standing up to the West, a leader restoring national pride, a leader defending Russian interests. Critics saw something very different, a leader concentrating power, suppressing opposition, and challenging the international order. Regardless of where people stood, one fact was impossible to deny. Vladimir Putin had become one of the most influential figures of the 21st century. Then came 2022, a moment that would once again place Russia at the center of world attention. The invasion of Ukraine. The conflict shocked the world, triggered sweeping sanctions, reshaped global alliances, and became the largest war in Europe in decades. Governments reacted, markets reacted, the entire world reacted, and once again, all eyes turned toward one man, Vladimir Putin. More than 70 years after his birth, the boy from post-war Leningrad remained one of the most powerful and controversial leaders on earth. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is not how Putin changed Russia. It's how the experiences of war, loss, collapse, and survival helped shape the man who would eventually lead it. From a crowded communal apartment to the Kremlin, from an unknown KGB officer to a global political force. The story of Vladimir Putin is also the story of modern Russia itself. For some, Vladimir Putin is the man who restored Russia's strength after years of uncertainty. For others, he is one of the most controversial leaders of the modern era. Supporters see a patriot, critics see an authoritarian ruler. Historians continue to debate his legacy, and that debate is unlikely to end anytime soon. But regardless of political views, one fact remains undeniable. The journey itself is extraordinary. A boy born in a city scarred by war, a child raised in hardship, a teenager searching for strength, a young man drawn to the world of intelligence. Step by step, year by year, he climbed higher. From the streets of Leningrad to the headquarters of the KGB, from the shadows of government to the halls of the Kremlin, and eventually to a position where his decisions could influence the course of world events. His story is not only the story of one man, it is also the story of modern Russia, a nation that experienced collapse, chaos, recovery, and confrontation, a nation still searching for its place in the world. Whether history ultimately remembers Vladimir Putin as a patriot, a strategist, a strongman, or something else entirely, will be decided by future generations. But one thing is certain, his impact on Russia and on the world will be studied for decades to come. From a crowded apartment in post-war Leningrad to becoming one of the most powerful men on earth, the rise of Vladimir Putin is one of the most remarkable political stories of the 21st century. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, what do you think history's final verdict on Vladimir Putin will be? We'll see you in the next story.